We spend our entire lives trying to make sense of pretty much everything, but if there's anything we spend the most time on, it's trying to figure out ourselves. When it comes to video games, there are plenty of heroes who have been through a whole lot, and while their deeds are usually the stuff of legends, their journeys are also filled with horror, heartbreak, and violence. One character that has undergone a tremendous amount of suffering over the course of his blood-stained existence is none other than the infamous Ghost of Sparta, Kratos. While it's possible to simply view Kratos as a warrior who revels in the destruction he brings upon his adversaries, this would be doing him a great disservice. For beneath all the rage, pain, and guilt is a man who is, at least on an emotional level, fundamentally no different from you and I. To gain a better understanding of Kratos' seemingly endless plight, it's necessary to delve deeper into his psyche and arrive at some logical conclusions regarding his psychology and, ultimately, what it is he desires more deeply than anything else. The great Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung defined two kinds of suffering that we as humans endure, namely meaningless and meaningful suffering. At face value, it may seem easy to distinguish between the two, but the more closely we consider it, the more we begin to understand that categorizing certain forms of suffering is far more difficult than we may have initially thought. For all intents and purposes, meaningless suffering is everywhere, but paradoxically, we end up trying to shoehorn this kind of suffering into the meaningful category using proverbs such as "everything happens for a reason." At once, this would imply that every single event, be it good or bad, has some direct motivation or underlying impetus behind it. But even then, does this mean that a given outcome is meaningful, or even more importantly, necessary? Ideally, we would probably prefer that all suffering be meaningful and necessary, since this would mean that everything unpleasant or awful that happens does indeed serve some higher purpose. However, what that higher purpose is, or why it in itself is necessary, is another matter altogether. So how exactly does all of this apply to Kratos then? Well, for one, it applies to all humans, so it certainly applies to Kratos, even if he has the blood of a god in his veins. But given the sheer amount of violence he has inflicted on others, as well as the violence that has been inflicted upon him, it arguably applies even more so since he has probably suffered more intensely and longer than most humans ever have or will. In his youth, Kratos was, much like most people in their early adult life, brash, dismissive, quick-tempered, and, worst of all, naive. His physical strength and vigor made him a formidable foe and an effective captain of the Spartan army, and given his prowess on the battlefield, it's reasonable to conclude that Kratos fervently believed that he was nigh immortal, or at the very least, unbeatable. But even though he may have been tremendously powerful on his own, Kratos was still a mortal being who was subject to all the shortcomings that plague human beings. Upon encountering a barbarian horde, and sure of his battlefield acumen, Kratos led his troops into battle against the enemy force without heed or hesitation. Unfortunately, this would end up being one of the biggest miscalculations Kratos would ever make, as it soon became apparent that he and his army were no match for the savagery of the barbarians. Unable to accept his untimely demise, and in his hubris, Kratos cried out in defiance to Ares, the god of war, pledging his life to his service in exchange for granting him the power to destroy the barbarians and save his men. Ares heard the Spartans' plea and accepted his offer, and Kratos and the Spartans were able to dispatch the barbarians, allowing them to live on in spite of what fate had ordained them. While Kratos certainly enjoyed the power afforded to him by Ares' patronage, the problem is that he had given up his autonomy and just about everything that had once bound him to the human condition, with the notable exception of his family. But given just how monstrous and cruel Kratos became the more he served Ares, the more his wife and daughter feared him, and the more alien they became to Kratos. Ironically, at a point where Kratos was arguably more powerful than he ever was prior, he was utterly devoid of anything that remotely resembled a decent, functional human being. Kratos willingly allowed himself to be hollowed out by the god of war, and so he was all too willing to inflict all manner of suffering on others, be it meaningful or meaningless, and in Kratos' case, it was all the latter. But as life always teaches us, there is a price for everything, and for his abandonment of himself and his humanity, Kratos would pay the ultimate toll. In his desire to gain complete control over Kratos, Ares tricked the Spartan into brutally murdering his wife Lysandra and daughter Calliope. Upon realizing the gravity of what he had done, Kratos was horrified and utterly broken by his own blindness and Ares' heinous cruelty. As punishment for his evil deed, an oracle cursed Kratos to forever have the ashes of his family bound to his flesh, turning his skin a pale greyish white and earning him the title the Ghost of Sparta. Feeling betrayed and consumed by grief, Kratos fell into a state of deep despair, and it is at this point he found himself at his lowest. But in spite of what he had done, Kratos felt immense remorse for his actions and clung to the idea that, by serving the gods of Olympus, he would find a way to forget his past and take revenge on his malefactor, Ares. It is this notion that would motivate Kratos for the next decade or so as he devoted his talents to the service of the other gods. But as he would gradually come to realize, the gods are capricious and cruel, and no matter how many foes he vanquished or lives he saved, he would not be able to escape the stain of what he had done or douse the fires of hate burning in his heart by serving in different entities with their own hidden, misguided agendas. If anything, Kratos' devotion to the gods only served to further enrage him as he began to distrust them all and developed a deep-seated contempt for the inhabitants of Olympus, with his most intense hatred being reserved for Ares in particular. Eventually, through his relentless vitriol and barbarity, Kratos would finally defeat Ares and become the god of war himself. But although he had ascended to divinity, and despite having defeated Ares, Kratos was still not satisfied and would turn his anger towards the rest of the gods, leading to a long, bloody campaign against them until he was finally able to slay his father Zeus and bring the Greek pantheon to an end. With no further enemies to face, and having taken vengeance upon all those who had wronged him, Kratos leapt from Olympus, seemingly ending his tragic, cruel life of meaningless suffering in the process. So was it actually vengeance that Kratos wanted all along? Did it make everything better and make his suffering stop? Of course not. Kratos' exploits during the Greek saga are a cautionary tale from beginning to end, teaching us that there is something far more important than revenge against our enemies, and that thing is redemption. In all honesty, it is not vengeance upon our enemies that we seek, but rather some means to forgive ourselves for our own flaws and poor decisions. In truth, Kratos never actually got any kind of real chance to seek this out and obtain it during his first life, so the fact that his story continues on in the Norse era essentially serves as his opportunity to find the one thing we all so desperately seek: peace. The Kratos we encounter at the beginning of 2018's God of War is physically older and, while obviously still very much Kratos, seemingly less fiery and wrathful. Having had time to contemplate his past and all of the pain he has experienced and inflicted on others, it is clear that Kratos feels ashamed of his younger self and regrets being a mindless slave to anger and hatred. The first real step towards Kratos' true redemption is finding love once again with a woman named Faye and having a son with her named Atreus. It's obvious that Kratos remembers Lysandra and Calliope and sets out to live a life with Faye and Atreus that he would have preferred to have lived with his original family in an attempt to atone for his past sins. And instead of being obstinate, cold, and distant, Kratos makes a concerted effort to appreciate his wife and child and allow them to shape him into a better man. But even though he tries to control his rage and open his heart to others, the reality is that the world under the Norse gods is not all that much different from the one Kratos experienced under the rule of the Greek pantheon. The truth is that Kratos can never fully escape his past, as none of us ever can. But regardless of this, he does find a way to come to terms with himself and live a more principled present life in which he takes responsibility for himself and his actions. What is interesting is the relationship Kratos cultivates with his son Atreus, and while he never truly had a father he could talk to or have a relationship with since he is the son of Zeus, Kratos tries to the best of his ability to impart wisdom and fatherly advice to Atreus so that he might deal with the world in a more courageous and meaningful way. And simply because he tries and cares, he actually does. The main difference between Kratos' Greek persona and his Norse one is that while his past self fought against something, his present self has something to fight for. In this way, Kratos has managed to shift from a life of meaningless suffering and cruelty to one in which his suffering is meaningful and directed. And this, my friends, is what we like to call character development, or put more plainly, growth. What actually makes Kratos such an endearing character, particularly his older self, is that he is prepared to take a good hard look at himself and admit to his mistakes, which takes a certain level of humility many people will never achieve. But Kratos is fully aware of the fact that to continue along the path he was walking would have been nothing short of madness and a road to even greater ruin. Instead of seeking violence, Kratos does his best to avoid it, but when faced with his demise and the loss of Atreus, he fights and does what is necessary to defend his honor and legacy. Kratos has thus evolved from a simple, unthinking instrument of death into a character who is more self-aware, willful, and ready to protect what he holds dear. While Kratos knows that he will never be able to fully escape the pain and suffering of his past, he chooses not to run from it, but rather accept it in the knowledge that remembering his mistakes can ultimately help him redeem himself and be a good example to Atreus as well as his fellow human beings. The tragedy for Kratos is that he is cursed to suffer for his transgressions, but he understands that at least by persisting in an uncertain, pernicious world, there are indeed things that make life beautiful and, moreover, worth fighting for. And thus concludes our analysis of the psychology of Kratos. What are your thoughts on Kratos as a character? And do you agree that he has grown? Or have we been too generous with our appraisal? Let us know in the comments. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more gaming news, reviews, and playthroughs. From me and the crew here at Metasquad, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Later!